welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic Practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. Now, I'd like to start talking about Egyptian deities a little bit more in the future, but I wanted to cover a little bit about pronunciation beforehand, because that's something that's rather difficult. The last issue we were just talking about is the name Jehudi, or Thoth, or Tot. He could have his own discussion by himself, but I wanted to cover a couple of important things first. For starters, in order to be academically correct, I have to point out that we don't know what the ancient Egyptian language sounded like as they would have spoken it, for several reasons. One, there's no one around who speaks ancient Egyptian anymore. The last form of the language is Coptic, and what's interesting is Coptic is used, it's considered a dead language, sort of like Latin. They use it in the Coptic Orthodox Church. They use that instead of Latin when they say their Mass. So Coptic is a source that we use to compare with the Egyptian language, but it's not the exact same. Another reason is because languages evolve over time. How many of us struggled to understand Shakespeare or Dickens in school? They're speaking or writing the Queen's English, but darn if it sounds anything like what we would say now. And of course, if Dickens or Shakespeare were to try to read Twitter, I think their heads would explode. That's because language evolves over time. And even the sounds of words evolves. If you've ever had Cajun food, that comes from a part of Louisiana that was originally called Acadia, but the name over time shortened from Acadia to Cajun. That's an example of language evolving. Another reason for this, why it's so hard to really understand exactly how the Egyptian language sounded, is because they didn't write all of their vowel sounds in. They wrote certain ones, or actually scholars will call them semivowels, and that's hard even for me to try to read through. Some of the technical stuff that you find in books on Egyptian language. But there's a similar phenomenon in Arabic. You might have seen on NBC several years ago. I think it was Tom Brokaw that went to a Middle Eastern country called Qatar. Actually, he asked a native there, is it Qatar or Qatar? It's spelled Qatar, but either pronunciation is correct because they're really flexible on their vowels. That's why they don't write them in a lot of Arabic and also in ancient Egyptian. When you see words written nowadays, they put E's in place of where they think the vowels were. And that's why you have some of the Egyptian names spelled the way they do, like Re, Heru, Hethert, Wesser. Those are kind of like nails on a chalkboard to me, because that's not actually how the names would have been said. That's just how it's written in an Egyptology book, because, face it, when you have folks that are writing papers on a doctoral level, they're not worried that much about how they're going to say it. They're more worried about how people are going to read it. So they put it in a form that you can read, and then they put in sort of a passing note. Well, it might be vocalized like whatever. And there's not even really a standard way of spelling how you would vocalize the name. It's crazy. So what I'm going to suggest is what you would consider a modern evolution of the language. It's not going to sound exactly like the ancient Egyptians would have said it. And of course, if you think about it, their civilization lasted for 3,000 years. Somebody during the age of the pyramids, if they were to speak to somebody from the time of the Ramessides, they might not understand each other. They might have to sit there and listen for a while and go, you talk funny. But that's because things change over time. Now, a book I'd like to recommend, From Pharaoh's Lips. This is a brilliant book. It's a very small book, but it's a fun read. And if you want to learn how to read Coptic, this is the book to get, because it has the Coptic alphabet, it has the Arabic alphabet, and the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic alphabet, all in this book, and it makes some very interesting comparisons. There are words that you wouldn't think they'd have had anything to do with ancient Egyptian, but they do. As a matter of fact, the word adobe, that comes from tub, which was the Egyptian word for mud brick. And if you know anyone named Susan, their name comes from ancient Egyptian. Actually, the Hebrew word was the same thing, and it was Sushan, and it means water lily. So that's a good way to impress your friends. Because of little clues like this, what we have in Egyptian Arabic, because there are so many words that kind of, stayed with them over the centuries, and you also have the Coptic liturgical language, and a few other clues from other languages that picked up words from the Egyptians, we can sort of piece together a good guess on certain vowels. But again, it's a best guess. So next episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about certain signs and sounds that you can read it, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you hear somebody saying it. And then we can start talking about some of the deities whose names use those sounds and how do you say that, and probably won't start with Jehudi, but he'll be on the list for certain. So, for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon wishing you Synapti.